What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and today we're gonna rank all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. Full transparency, this is not one of my favorite film franchises. In fact, I probably dislike most of these movies, so if you don't agree with some of my opinions, just know that I'm not claiming to be an expert, and you're probably justified in your reasoning for not liking this list. But regardless, I would appreciate if you did like this video and subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and let me know in the comments down below what your Texas Chainsaw rankings are. Let's get into it. In 9th place is Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3. A young couple traveling through Texas gets into an accident after witnessing an apparent murder at a beaten down gas station. They're soon hunted by Leatherface and the Sawyer clan, where they're slowly tortured over the course of the night. So this might surprise a lot of people because I'm sure most of you don't have this at the very bottom. I just rewatched it for the purposes of this ranking, and it literally took me 3 tries to get through it. Mostly because I kept falling asleep because I find this one to be so boring. But also, I couldn't even tell you what happens in this movie. There's no real semblance of a plot or story structure. It's just kind of stuff happening. I mean, I know objectively this is not the worst movie, but for me, if I watch a movie that many times and I have no idea what it's about, and not only that, but really have no desire to go back and watch it, I really see no problem with having that as my last place. And for a movie that's titled Leatherface, it has the least to do with him out of any of the family members. Interestingly enough, the rights to the franchise had been purchased by New Line Cinema at the time because they wanted to have the monopoly on Freddy, Jason, and Leatherface, but then they couldn't even figure out what to do with him, that by the time their contract had expired, they were happy to just pass the franchise off to someone else. Not to mention the fact that the director himself has disowned the movie, so I really don't feel too bad about putting this in last place. In 8th place is Leatherface. After the daughter of a local sheriff is found dead on the Sawyer family farm, their young son is apprehended as retribution and sent to live in a mental institution. 10 years later, he escapes during a riot and is taken hostage along with a nurse by several murderous inmates. This probably feels the least Texas Chainsaw Massacre out of any of these movies. First of all, this is the second origin story for the character of Leatherface. And again, for a movie that's called Leatherface, he is one of the most sidelined characters here. It's probably not until the last 15 minutes that it does kind of become a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie, but just, you know, why do we need more prequels? I hate prequels, by the way. Like, prequels are the lowest form of horror movie content, in my opinion. I would take remakes, requels, television spin-offs before I took a prequel, because I don't need to have questions answered that, like, A, I never even like asked the questions for, and B, like, we're not learning anything new here. It's just ground that we've already covered. The other problem with this movie is that it's heavily predicated on this sort of twist of, I guess, not knowing who Leatherface is, because they introduce us to this group of mental patients and we're made to believe that he's the bigger guy. And so they include this line early on.
Most of these kids are given a new name so they can hide from their degenerate criminal families.
Which basically telegraphs the eventual misdirection. But the reveal of it, like, never really materialized in a way that it was like, gotcha, it just kind of happened. The characterization of the guy who turns out to be Leatherface is also completely off. Like, it doesn't make any sense how he becomes Leatherface in the end. I'd say that the only saving grace of this movie is probably Lily Taylor as Verna, but that's basically it. In 7th place is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning. Depicting the origins of the 2003 remake, the film follows Thomas Hewitt, also known as Leatherface, as he commits his first act of murder, which precipitates a chain of events that sees the rest of the family cover up the crime. Meanwhile, 2 brothers and their girlfriends, who are driving across the country to enlist in the Vietnam War, become the unfortunate casualties of the family's madness. This is going to be a very controversial placement because I've read a lot of people's comments on my channel prior to this, and the general consensus seems to be that this is a good movie. And, you know, to each their own, that's completely fair, but the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning, to me, is just like this empty void of darkness, which I mean, it's not even fun. That is like the key ingredient to these movies. Like even some of the darker ones are at least fun. This is the most cynical, miserable movie of the lot. Like even the two that I ranked below this have more joy in them. But again, like with Leatherface 2017, this movie just presents a lot of answers that I never had the questions for. Like it basically just shows us what we already knew. And it's never interesting, it's never surprising. We just spend the bulk of this movie watching people get tortured. And then everything with the ending, it's just so bleak. I mean, you could have guessed that that would be the direction it was heading in, but again, I ask, why do we need to see an entire feature-length movie that has already been established to us in a previous movie? Also, just in terms of the timelines, like this being the remake timeline, I'm not as interested in it as the regular one. Like other than Arlie or me, the Hewitts are far inferior to me than the Sawyers are. So there's a lot of interesting decisions here that, I'll speak to more of when I get to the remake placement. If I have to give this one positive, I'll say that it's paced a lot better than some of these. Like it doesn't take very long for the action and mayhem to begin, and from that point on, it's straight through to the finish. So other than being atrociously unpleasant, it's actually not as much of a slog to get through time-wise. In sixth place is Texas Chainsaw. Retconning the original timeline, the film picks up immediately after the events of the 1973 massacre, where a mob of Texans murder most of the Sawyer clan in an act of vigilante justice. Leatherface escapes, but a young Sawyer baby is kidnapped, where she's raised by the people who murdered her mother. 40 years later, she learns of an inheritance left behind by the Sawyer family matriarch, which brings along with it a dark family secret. There's actually a lot of fun to be had with Texas Chainsaw 3D. I just think that this is really the stupidest movie here, and I don't know what went wrong because there was clearly like a lot of care that went into like specific details, but then just like this huge oversight of having this take place 40 years later, and the main character, who was a baby in that flashback, is now 25 years old. So right off the bat, it's so absurd that there would be that big of an oversight. I mean, it's really hard to believe that this movie is not in last place, because to me, this is like the Halloween resurrection of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. And that movie, in my opinion, is the worst of the Halloweens. Obviously, this was a 3D movie when it was released, and that was a trend that I really didn't care for, and I'm glad it pretty much died off, because it's one of those things where the studio is obviously going to be more concerned with the practical matters of filming it rather than the story itself. But I have to say that in terms of the story, I actually don't mind this one as much. I like the fact that it starts off where these movies normally do, like with a group of friends embarking on a road trip, and just the fact that it takes a turn and becomes a completely different movie by the end entirely, that I appreciate. It is interesting to see Leatherface presented as more of an anti-hero this time around, where usually he's like, the villain. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but there actually is quite a bit of nuance to this movie. But, it does the whole requel thing. It has that awful fucking line.
Do your thing, cuz.
Honestly, this franchise is such a hot mess that this is a prime example of just how they fail with every time they try to fix things or reboot it. Like, it makes no sense. It's just kind of there in its own timeline, but obviously, in my opinion, I think they could do a lot worse. In fifth place is Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. A group of young entrepreneurs arrive in the middle of Texas to gentrify a small ghost town where they plan on auctioning off its properties. Unbeknownst to them, Leatherface has been seeking refuge in an orphanage there run by an elderly woman and begins wreaking havoc on the tourists as they repossess his home. Meanwhile, Sally Hardesty, the original massacre survivor, is now a Texas Ranger hell-bent on getting revenge. So I watched this movie the night it premiered on Netflix, and I hated it. I watched it again for a second time, and surprisingly, I liked it a lot better. I still think that it's stupid as all hell, but I mean, just based off of the rest of the franchise, it's not that bad by comparison. I think that the movie's biggest weakness of anything is probably the fact that Sally Hardesty is in it, because she didn't need to be in it. And this is nothing against the new actress who plays her, as she's obviously filling in for Marilyn Burns, who sadly sadly passed away, because she actually does a good job in the role. Like, I look at her and I can believe that this is the same character, but just in the way that the story treats her, that's where the disrespect really starts to come in. Because first of all, she's barely in the movie, and when she does show up, she's just basically a deus ex machina to help these sisters out, but also just the stupid decisions she makes. It's to a point where it's so frustrating to watch, because even though I can see this as being Sally 50 years later, there's no way that she's not going to take that shot at Leatherface when she has the chance. Like, it's such a contrived script. And then obviously, like, the rest of the characters in this, like, they are extremely unlikable. Surprisingly enough, my favorite character is actually Richter, the carpenter. I think that's his name. Just because he actually holds these idiots accountable for the stupid shit that they're doing. I also didn't mind, like, the main sister, like the surviving sister, but I felt that they really mishandled her storyline. There was obviously a deeper social commentary there, that she was a survivor of a school shooting, but the way they glossed over it felt maybe a little exploitative, because it didn't really serve any character or story purpose. Like, it would have been the same movie with or without it, so they could have at least addressed it a little more. On a positive note, I really liked the gore, and I feel that's what a lot of people are currently being drawn towards here, and probably because it still feels fun. Like, it's not overly morose or distasteful to the point of having to look away from the screen. And also, this might be one of the first times where Leatherface is really at the forefront of the movie. Honestly, I think a lot of people have very high expectations of this franchise based on the success of Scream and Halloween, and they go into this not really understanding what it is and start incorrectly throwing out terms like woke. Like, these movies have always been dealing with social and political themes. It's just that most of us weren't around when the originals came out, so their underlying messages aren't as noticeable to newer generations as the more contemporary ones are. I'm still not saying this isn't a stupid movie, because it really is, but if you didn't like this one for those reasons, you probably wouldn't have liked the original when that came out either. I could honestly go on about this movie a lot more, and fortunately, if you would like more of a deep dive into this, as well as the entire franchise in general, I've already covered 2 episodes of it on my podcast, The Cherry Picker. And if you didn't know, yes, I do have a podcast, which I started for my subscribers who were wanting me to cover more long-form content. So if you're interested, you can listen to The Cherry Picker on various podcast platforms, or watch it here on YouTube by heading over to the official channel page, where I offer additional insights into all of the horror movies I do and don't already cover on this channel. In 4th place is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. On the night of their senior prom, 4 teens get into a car accident in a rural area of Texas and wander onto an old farmhouse to look for assistance. It isn't long before Leatherface and the next generation of Sawyers begin killing them off, culminating in the revelation that the family is being funded by a secret society who pays them to terrorize innocent people. I think that this is the one movie that has unanimously been decided as being the worst Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I really don't agree with that. I mean, I understand why, because it is really bad, but it's also really entertaining. You guys should know how I feel about franchises' campy entries by now, but this one is so off-the-wall nuts that it's astonishing to me that Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger were able to move on from this and become Academy Award-winning actors. Make no mistake, I'm not crazy about this movie, but what I do like about it is that it's probably most closely aligned with the aesthetic of the original. Like, it just has that really rough and low-budget vibe to it that, you know, it feels more like a Texas Chainsaw movie. It doesn't excuse the fact that this movie is a mess. Like, there's stuff involving the Illuminati, and then you have, like, some of the worst acting of this franchise here.
Somebody kill me, please.
It's my fault. If he dies, I'll be a murderer.
But like with all campy entries inside of other horror franchises, I approach this one as though it's more of a comedy than a horror. And that really helped shape my perspective and enjoy the movie a lot more than I would otherwise. I feel like this entry is also overlooked for having really great chase scenes. So just in terms of like another facet that we had seen in the original, this one probably most closely resembles that in that regard. And I get it. This is a really stupid movie, and I don't fault anyone for having it really low in their ranking, but I also don't see any point in really squabbling over what might be considered to be the worst of the worst, since there are so many bad movies we're dealing with here. So rather than dwelling on those, let's just move on to the top 3, which I actually think are good. Starting with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In this 2003 remake, 5 friends who are heading to a concert after purchasing drugs in Mexico pick up a despondent hitchhiker who shoots herself in the head in their van. Panicked, they alert the local sheriff, but soon discover that the small town and its residents are not what they seem and find themselves fighting to survive a night of terror. While I do think that this is a good movie, I don't necessarily think it's a great one. The advantage it has for me is that it was really the first of its kind. I think that the only remakes for horror movies that were really coming up before this were the Dark Castle stuff. So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was really looked at as being the pioneer of the remake movement of the 2000s. And you know, some of them are better than others, and this just happens to be one of them. I think this one definitely captures the tone of the original, but that's kind of just about it. This mostly feels like a completely separate beast, and I think most of that has to do with just how polished the production of this movie looks. And obviously that is a little contradicting to say because this movie is very drab and gloomy, but just in terms of the way it's designed, it looks manufactured and expensive, which takes away from the grittiness that was inherently part of the original's charm. And that kind of went on to be the practice for all horror remakes after this one. So personally, I do feel a little jaded towards it for that, but I think why I put this one a little higher is because there are less things about it that offend me. Like, it's a pretty straightforward horror movie, but you know how I was saying with Texas Chainsaw: The Next Generation, how I really liked the chase scenes they had in that movie. I feel like with this one, and you know, all remakes really in general, is that they did this thing where there was no longer this isolated set piece within the movie, but rather like an extended portion of just jumping from scene to scene and like running from people and places without like really giving us anything that looks or feels different from the last time we saw it happening. Typically, chase scenes should be 2 to 3 minutes tops, and here they're kind of used excessively to pad the runtime. So because of that, the last third of the movie feels like it's just meandering towards the inevitable, and it really spreads the tension out way too thin. In second place is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. After a seemingly prank call is placed into a radio show, the station's DJ brings forth a recording as evidence that another chainsaw murder has taken place. Meanwhile, the Sawyer family tries to seize the recording, where they're then pursued by a former Texas Ranger who's been hunting them down for the past 13 years. I think mostly this is just a really fun movie. That's what it comes down to. And it doesn't have the absurdity or dollar store bin VHS value of The Next Generation. It's just an all-around well-crafted, campy good time. And you know, I love everyone in this movie. I think this is the Sawyer family at its best. Like, it had the best representation from all the members. Like, just for me, I enjoy Leatherface more when he's kind of like a goofy comedic character. We also have Caroline Williams and Dennis Hopper, so it's an all-around like really great cast. I also really like the music in this one. It's sort of a blend of that typical 80s synthesized score with some major Hitchcockian influences. I actually just ordered the vinyl from Waxwork Records, so I'm eager to add that to my collection behind me. But other than that, I really just enjoy this one unironically, so I guess because of that, I have less to say about it. I mean, we knew going into this that I wasn't going to be as verbose about my opinions with this particular franchise, so let's just get to the first, which is obviously going to be the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original. 5 friends take a road trip to rural Texas to visit the burial site of one of their grandfathers after it's reported that the cemetery had been desecrated, with several corpses also having been stolen from their graves. On their way home, they run out of gas and happen upon an old farmhouse which is inhabited by a cannibalistic family who picks the group off one by one. I always hate to be basic by putting the original in first, but with a lot of these movies, and especially where this franchise is concerned, this really is objectively the best one. And for me, that mostly comes down to the fact that it has what the other entries don't, and that's historical relevance. It really was the first movie of its kind, and you know, that along with The Exorcist really pushed the genre into a new direction. I will say that the climax of the movie is really terrifying, and it really adds to the fact that it's, you know, got that gritty gritty grindhouse feel to it because it does look like it could actually be rooted in real life. Just in terms of all of the performances across the franchise, Gunnar Hansen in that first movie really delivered the best version of that character. And just in terms of the ending itself, like the shot of Sally on the back of that pickup truck is one of the most iconic moments of horror history. But in truth, this is not a top 10 movie for me. I don't even know if it breaks my top 20. For better or worse, I feel that it's a movie that's reputation far exceeds it. So, I mean, if you are a Texas Chainsaw Massacre purist, you could probably take my nonchalance as an indicator for how wrong my read is on this franchise. I just mostly respect this for what it did. I want to thank my Patreon supporter, Dookie Blair. If you guys want to check out more of my horror franchise rankings, you can click on this playlist over here. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.